What's up, my dude? Your friendly neighborhood Tony here, and now that I've seen the most recent movie in the Evil Dead series, I think it's time for me to rank every single film.
Groovy.
Now, of course, before I get started here, I want to say I don't think there are any bad movies in the entire Evil Dead franchise at all. In fact, I would say that all of the movies are at least good, if not great. So, for the ones that I rank lower on the list, don't think that I hate those movies. I absolutely do not. And also, this is going to be based on my opinion. So this isn't necessarily what I think are cinematically the most intricate and blah, blah, blah. No, this is just the movies that I like to watch. So of course, let me know what your ranking is in the comments below. I'm sure it's going to be different for just about all of us. And there's nothing wrong with that, okay? It's okay. I'm here for you. But all that aside, all right, let's get started with the fifth movie in my ranking, and that is one that I think is probably not too controversial. The fifth movie in my ranking is the 2013 Fede Alvarez movie called Evil Dead. Now again, this by no means is me saying that the movie is not good. I think it's very good, in fact. And I remember when it came out, there was a lot of speculation and a lot of trepidation about whether or not this was going to be able to live up to the original trilogy. And yeah, in a lot of ways it did. Of course, with the Fede Alvarez Evil Dead, they definitely go off in a different direction as far as the comedy is concerned. There are still a few kind of funny moments throughout the movie, but it is absolutely nowhere near as slapstick as the prior film, which would have been Army of Darkness. It is super dark. There is a ton of gore and blood. I remember at the time that it came out, they were bragging about how much fake blood they used in this movie, which I think was only recently outdone by the most recent release in the Evil Dead series. So this was a super gory, super dark in a lot of ways reimagining of the franchise. And if I had any criticism for it, it would be something that I think is super important to have in any movie that you're doing, and that is characters that you like and are interested in. And I think that's where this movie kind of fell short, and the reason why I put it at the bottom of my ranking. I don't think any of the characters in this movie were particularly likable or people that you really cared about. It had an interesting concept where the main girl was trying to overcome addiction, and so that was kind of cool to see how she dealt with, am I just tripping balls right now, or are there demons coming out of the floor? Like, it was really cool to see that what they call unreliable narrator told in this fashion. Although, of course, we all knew what was actually going on, but just the fact that she didn't necessarily. And then, of course, it was a new and interesting way to tell the trapped in a cabin story. You know, in the original Evil Dead movies, they had their own way of keeping the characters in this location, but here we had a totally different reason because they were trying to keep her there until she got clean, essentially. So it was a cool concept, an interesting spin, a different take as far as the comedy, but it just didn't have characters that I cared a lot about. And so because of that, I have to put it at number 5 on my ranking. Again, still a good movie. I enjoyed it, just not quite as much as the others. All right, coming in at number 4, this is where it might start to get a little controversial. And again, remember, this is my ranking of my favorite Evil Dead movies, the ones that I go back to and watch time and time again. And so because of that, one of the ones I watch the least is the original. So the original The Evil Dead came out in 1981, so it's over 40 years old at this point. And if you watch it more recently, you can definitely tell that it's an older film. Not only that, but it was a pretty low budget film at the time it came out. I think it was Sam Raimi's first feature film, in fact. And now, of course, I'm not going to hold that against him. You know, he had a very limited budget. He could only work with certain actors at the time that he could afford. And despite those limitations, he really shines through in this movie. You get to see his style, his very unique way of controlling the camera, his blend of horror and comedy, even though it was nowhere near as comedically charged as some of the sequels. But there was still a hint of it in this movie. You also get to see Ash for the first time, played by Bruce Campbell, who has gone on to become a national treasure, I would say. And really, it was a different kind of Ash. In this movie, he was just a normal dude, kind of a scaredy cat, and he wouldn't go on to become kind of his cocky, fun Ash that we know and love until the later films. But despite that, despite the low budget, despite the limitations, this is just a really good cabin in the woods horror movie. And when you watch it on its own, if you know you don't have the lens of modern cinema and of the modern movies, it's pretty incredible what they were able to do with the low budget that they had and the time that this took place. You know, you didn't really have CG or anything like that, so it's a lot of practical effects. And although you may look back on them and say, oh, that really doesn't hold up well, at the time, it was wild. But again, if we're talking about movies that I'm going to go back and watch time and time again, this one I'll still watch here and there, and I'll still recommend to people if you're going to start watching the Evil Dead series, start with the original, but I just don't get quite as much enjoyment out of it as some of the others. Now, one that I do get a lot of enjoyment out of and is very similar to the first Evil Dead movie is coming in at number 3 on my list, and that is Evil Dead 2, which I think if I remember correctly, the subtitle of it was Evil Dead 2 Dead by Dawn, which is a great name for a movie. And it also ties into one of the scenes in the movie where all of the Deadites are chanting Dead by Dawn, Dead by Dawn. Evil Dead 2, in my estimation, is what Sam Raimi wanted to do with Evil Dead 1, but probably was just limited by his budget. It's kind of a sequel to the original, but also really more of just a reimagining or a remake of it. And it definitely leans more into the comedic elements that Sam Raimi would come to move and implement into a lot of his future movies. You get to see Ash being a little bit more of a badass than he was in the original movie. I think the special effects are better in this one. There's, again, a lot more humor, just funny little moments. The Deadites are scary and yet still funny, which is an interesting mixture to balance. And yeah, because of that, it is most definitely one of my favorite in the series. I had a really hard time placing the second and third movies in my list, so this one could have been in second place, but I dropped it down to third place, and it may be an issue with recency bias. So definitely know that, and know that it gets a little foggy when you get up to the top 3. All right. And then there are only 2 movies left here. Can you guess which one's going to be my number 1 pick? Either way, I think it's going to be a little controversial. All right, coming in at number 2, my second favorite movie in the Evil Dead franchise, believe it or not, is Evil Dead Rise. Now, this is a movie that I just saw in theaters the other day. I did a review on it, so if you want to check that out, it's over on my channel. But in short, I think this movie does what they attempted to do with the 2013 remake in so many better ways. I like that they kind of took it out of the cabin in the woods, which is honestly something we haven't really done in any other movie titled Evil Dead. And yet they still were able to maintain that sense of being trapped in this LA apartment building. I think this is by far the scariest in the entire Evil Dead series. I think it is absolutely the goriest. And despite the fact that it's directed by a pretty newcomer to directing, Lee Cronin, I believe is his name, you can tell that he is himself a massive fan of not just the Evil Dead series, but just horror movies in general. There are a lot of little hints, little call outs to things like The Shining and a number of other horror movies as well. I love the familial element. You remember earlier I was talking about how the most important thing in a movie is to have characters that you care about. And I mean, who are you going to care more about than an actual family in the film and, you know, the risk of them killing each other? So I really appreciate how they were able to tie that into the movie and make it just really compelling from that regard. It does have some issues, I think, towards the end where it falls apart just a bit, but all in all, I would say it was very satisfying and absolutely a movie I'm going to watch a number of times going forward. So yeah, for me, coming in second place, Evil Dead Rise, which only leaves one left, and that is, honestly, my favorite movie in the series. I know it's not considered by many to be the best, but for me, I will watch this movie over and over again and never get tired of it. And that is Army of Darkness. So Army of Darkness is the third movie in the Evil Dead franchise. It came out in 1992, and it is, I think, the biggest departure from the rest of the series. It certainly still has a lot of the same horror elements, but this one goes full on into the slapstick comedy region of filmmaking. You get to see Bruce Campbell going full on badass Ash. Of course, in this movie, it also doesn't take place in a cabin in the woods. At least the very beginning does, but then it kind of goes off into some crazy alternate reality history world. But it's also the only movie that's not called Evil Dead, so that makes sense. And it's interesting. I feel like with Sam Raimi, whenever he does trilogies, the third movie is always kind of a weird spin-off of the others, whether that's with this or with something like the Spider-Man trilogy, except in this case, it works. The movie is a ton of fun. It's still pretty spooky in a lot of ways, but oddly enough, I feel like more accessible. And I feel like it also really opens up the world of the Evil Dead. You know, we've been stuck prior to this movie and even since in our own modern day telling of what's going on. All the stories kind of follow the same thing. It's a group of people in a confined environment, basically going through the same series of events as they have in all the other tellings. But in this one, we just go off in a completely different direction, and it kind of opens up the possibilities of what something like the Necronomicon can do. So for that, I also really enjoyed. I like the idea that we could do all kinds of crazy things with this movie and with this book. So yeah, for me, Army of Darkness, my favorite Evil Dead movie. I'm almost certain a lot of you will not agree with that, but if you do, let me know in the comments. Also, make sure you check out my full review for Evil Dead Rise. And if you want to see more ranking videos just like this, make sure you subscribe. All right, I'll catch you in the next one. Be good.